We operate around 8 or 9 communities today. They range from everything from pre-sales engineering to legal operations to large communities for small and medium kind of business entrepreneurs. I ran the Chief of Staff Network as a free community for the first 3.5 years. We always like to joke, if you're not interested in Japanese nail art, like you're not going to find the Japanese nail art community, but there's a big one out there. And and these communities are making money as well. Like they can be real, sustainable, and profitable businesses. Community founders are very much alone. It's the communities that have it the hardest tend to focus on the widest market. Those conversations are not happening on LinkedIn and Twitter. The real part of professional growth, I think, is happening in these private communities. There's a difference also between a SaaS business using a community to drive, community-led growth than the communities that I think you and I are talking about, where again, the community is the product, the community is the business, and there's nothing else kind of being sold along the sides of it. I'm in the Slack camp. As much as I love the Circles and the Mighty Networks of the world, I may be in a camp all by myself and saying, I don't think that the all-in-one solutions are really where the best communities are going to be built. I think so much of the community comes down, and you're the face of this as well, it comes down to connections, right? Our members meeting other members. The beauty of these communities is that they can foster a sense of belonging, a sense of identity to their members that opens them up to the experience of meeting other people in similar shoes as their own.
Welcome to Beginner Maps, where we interview operators of top community businesses so you can replicate the best of what these community builders have already figured out. Today, I am thrilled to have Scott Amenta with us. Scott is the founder of Chief of Staff Network and co-founder of Sylva, where he invests in community businesses like Chief of Staff and creates software for them. Over the past few years, Sylva has grown several communities to 7 and 8 figures of revenue profitably while studying tens of thousands more. Scott, I am really excited to learn from you on this episode.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate being here.
Thanks, Scott. Okay, I want to start by hitting the hammer on the head. So, from the perspective of an investor buying a community business, what does a healthy community business look like to you? Are there any telltale signs you've seen?
So you've probably heard the metaphor, healthy community businesses tend to look like gardens, right? Well-tended gardens. And a garden is, easy to let go, let the weeds grow, and it can still look like a garden, but it's going to be a very different thing than you probably envisioned. When we look at communities, we're primarily looking at the most common elements. Are they engaged? Are they diverse? Are they building a sense of belonging between their members? Now that's not the financial aspects of a community business, right? That's the actual makings of the community. And I think it's important to separate kind of those two elements. Is the community healthy and engaged? And do they have a healthy community business, diversified revenue streams, different monetization opportunities, a total addressable market that's large enough to grow beyond the point where they are today? That's kind of what it takes to, think about whether or not the investment is actually worth making. And, we've spent the better part of the last couple of years making those hard decisions, saying no more often than we've said yes, and acquiring kind of a number of really interesting businesses that we've now rolled up into a holding company of communities.
That's interesting. Okay, I want to double click on a couple of the things you said there. You mentioned engagement. So unpack that for us. When you as an investor are looking at engagement, are you looking at just the flat, the engagement numbers like weekly active users, or are there other things that show you that the community is engaged?
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly boil the ocean in terms of touch points that members are engaging on and what might be the kind of critical factors to weigh. If a community is based on Slack, that's a pretty obvious touch point to go look at first, see, what percentage of those members are active, on kind of what cadence. Are they sending a lot of their messages by DMs or in public channels? Are conversations actually getting answered in those public channels, especially for professional communities, which is really kind of our bread and butter? People are coming for kind of real life work challenges, and they're trying to solve those problems in real time. And they can do that more effectively with a group of peers that are similar to themselves. And so if we see kind of that engagement, that back and forth happening between members, and it's ideally a large percentage of their members, that's a pretty healthy indication that the community is doing well. Now, it's not the only touch point, right? That community may be running events. They may have a podcast. They may have a pretty active blog or a newsletter. And plenty of members will also, attend those events, open that newsletter, listen to that podcast. And those are also signals of, hey, people are getting value out of this community, even if they're not actively contributing to Slack. And so it's certainly that kind of melting pot of data that you need to take into account. Now, the challenge of buying a business, even in a data room, you don't necessarily get clean data and things that are easily actionable to make a decision off of. And so very often we have to read between the lines. We will talk to members, do things like that to make a decision.
Hmm. And when you say total addressable market and the opportunity to grow, how do you judge that? Because communities as a business, like, you can have like a few hundred people and charge them like 50, $80 a month. It can be a pretty sizable business. So I would assume that the total addressable market does not need to be as big as, let's say, for a SaaS business, but how do you think about it?
Not as big as a SaaS business. I think it's important to consider that most community businesses are probably not venture backable ventures, right? And you've certainly seen community businesses that have come and some have gone that were venture backed, to kind of a large scale. It very often doesn't fit cleanly in most VCs kind of theses. And so when we look at TAM, it's more in consideration of how big is the market, but also what percentage of that market does this community kind of own today? That might be owned through memberships. It might be owned through, who's subscribed to one of their channels on LinkedIn, on newsletter, or podcast again, and how big can they possibly grow given the types of revenue opportunities that they have. So, a good example, the community that I originally started, the Chief of Staff Network, there's only so many chiefs of staff in the world, right? It's not a very big market. And there's a few kind of main players when it comes to courses and professional offerings for communities today. Is it more competitive than other spaces? Probably not. But it is a relatively small group of individuals that we're all targeting. And so that's very different than, say, a community like Tech Ladies, which is for women in digital technology, right? They're engineers, they're product managers, they're designers. That's a very large addressable market, right? Not just in the United States, but globally, and has lots of different avenues and kind of user personas that they can cater to, at the very junior end for women just getting into tech, to the very senior end, female CTOs and heads of product. And so, very different offerings for kind of those audiences, but also probably a much bigger opportunity in terms of its total size and the type of revenue that it might drive through those types of programs.
Mhm. That makes a lot of sense. So you started Chief of Staff Network, which is of the former kind where the total addressable market is smaller. Have you also invested in communities like Tech Ladies where the market is much bigger?
So we look at both, and our kind of portfolio is not just small communities and not just large communities. They're usually somewhere in between. A community, we're typically investing or buying communities that have one or more revenue streams that feel like they have the potential to continue growing. Those revenue streams may be membership revenue, as we just described, sponsorship revenue or advertising kind of dollars that may be put against media. We can get into, is a community a media business or are media business communities, because the two are very much today. We're converging. Talent revenue is another interesting kind of revenue stream that we see with a lot of growth. And then conferences, events, any of the kind of ticketed items that may be applicable to members, but also to a wider audience, depending on who they're serving, is also a revenue stream that we see with a lot of potential for growth. When we're investing in or buying communities, we're typically looking at those 4 or 5 revenue streams. Has the community tested or iterated in any one of those? And what's the kind of room for growth in each one of those with more investment?
Hmm. Makes sense. And you mentioned that community business, is not really a venture backable business, but you are investing in such businesses. So, why did you get into the community, the business of buying communities and investing in communities? Like, where do you see the opportunity here?
So I ran the Chief of Staff Network as a free community for the first 3.5 years. So no paid membership, very limited sponsorships, but really just to cover the cost of dinner. Some of our members would get their companies to pay for pizza and beer while we commandeered their office to, have an event. It was very DIY. And, and I saw that it was providing a lot of value to the members, equally value for me as a member. But I realized that in order for it to be sustainable and kind of long lasting, for me to dedicate a lot more of my time to it, for me to, be able to hire a team around it to build out more of the content, the courses, the programs, the events, to do that, not just in New York, but, on a more global scale, required it to be something more than it was. And when I went from a free community to a paid community and I tacked on a membership price, that was arguably one of the hardest things I've done in my career, but definitely one of the best learning opportunities and certainly the best thing that the community needed. When I did that, I also met my co-founder in the Chief of Staff Network. So another testament to just the power that these communities have in terms of building real connections between people. And him and I were generally interested in the community space and realized very quickly that, Chief of Staff Network, of course, was not the only community out there. There were dozens, hundreds, actually thousands of communities doing very similar things in their own dedicated niche. We always like to joke if you're not interested in Japanese nail art, like you're not going to find the Japanese nail art community, but there's a big one out there. And and these communities are making money as well. Like they can be real, sustainable, and profitable businesses. They may not be, again, like the venture backable kind of SaaS platform, you know, and I think Tom and I agreed on at least one thing that it's as difficult to build $1 million business as it is to build $1 billion business. It really just depends on where you invest your time. And I knew pretty quickly that, again, going back to TAM, Chief of Staff Network was never going to be the biggest company, but it certainly could be an interesting business. And a lot of the learnings that we took from building that community, starting a founders community called Propel, and then exploring kind of the market of communities out there and talking to lots of community founders, we realized a couple things. One, community founders are very much alone. It's kind of ironic that building a business is often a very lonely experience. Community managers are surrounded by members, they're very people-centric businesses, and yet they're still very alone in the experience of building their community. Most community leaders are great at running communities, but very often lack the kind of business skills, kind of strategic skills to actually run the business effectively, or just don't want to do it. Managing people, dealing with finance and operations, not everybody's cup of tea. And we found great community leaders very often are amazing forward-facing people running events, engaging with their community, talking to their community members, understanding where the challenges are and building the services to provide that value. But at the end of the day, do they want to run finance and close the books at the end of the month? Not really. And so Sylva was really born out of that need. How do we think about running all of the back office operations, support, people ops, finance for community businesses? And how do we layer on other services that help them to grow and build more of the products that members are demanding? While not doing it alone, our communities are together, they're engaging with each other, they're learning from each other every day. And that closeness helps to drive the entire business.
Mhm. That makes a lot of sense. You basically take all the boring stuff of building a community business away from the people, the operators of these communities, so that they can just focus on running the communities while you handle the finance side of things or the HR or I don't know, the toolings and all of that.
That's right.
And how have you found any common cross learnings that you have been able to, be like if you acquired a new community tomorrow, like would there be a 5 step thing that you would be like, okay, let's do this, and these are what we'll do to take to the next level?
Yeah, so there's a kind of a common framework that we use for each one of the communities. It kind of depends on the stage that we're acquiring them at. A much younger community may have a membership offering, but maybe only one version of that offering. Ideally, it has some kind of website, some kind of brand online presence. But very often we find that those things are lacking, right? They're either not providing enough value to their members, or maybe their top of funnel marketing, their SEO, their brand awareness is, leaves something to be desired. So the first thing that we usually do is a full evaluation of what tech platforms this community is using. What are they using to run themselves effectively? And then that's usually followed by my team, product and engineering and data, doing, in some cases, a full scale migration over to the platform of choice for our business. That's not always consistent across every community, right? Each business is its own thing. But very often we try to put them on similar platforms as we can. From there, then we're very much turning towards strategy and operations and thinking more about, okay, is the pricing model of this membership the correct offering? Is the way that they're approaching sponsors or advertisers actually, being managed appropriately given the types of offerings that they have by way of events and content and other areas where those sponsors might show up? Are they doing anything around talent or, kind of job placements? And, and is the community demanding that, right? I think any revenue facing initiative has to go in parallel or complement any of the kind of value added initiatives that members are getting. And so as soon as those two things contradict each other, community businesses tend to fail pretty quickly. And so, if the membership price is too high and the market is not demanding or not, not willing to pay for that price, then something has to give. And so we do a lot of that kind of diligence up front, trying to better understand the market before we make any irrational decisions about where to turn the community's attention.
Can you tell me about some of the other communities in your portfolio apart from Chief of Staff Network?
Who am I allowed to talk about?
Okay.
So yeah, so there's a few. I can talk in broad strokes rather than naming names.
Okay.
That's okay. So we operate around 8 or 9 communities today. They range from everything from pre-sales engineering to legal operations to large communities for small and medium kind of business entrepreneurs, women in digital technology. And so they're quite a range. They all fit pretty cleanly in the kind of professional discipline where there is a niche audience that, resembles other people in their profession, typically with similar challenges and a similar career path, or at least opportunities for growth. And we build the kind of products and services to cater directly to those user personas.
Got it. And apart from like talking about broad strokes, apart from membership fees and say sponsorship fees, are there any major sources of revenue for a community like this?
Talent is definitely one of them. That comes in a couple different forms. It can come through talent partnerships, or it can come through kind of talent placements. And obviously, like recruiting can be very generalized, right? At like the ground level stakes, basically job boards. Those job boards may have some paid features on top of them. At its most like white glove kind of status is, really hand-holding a company through hiring a particular role and, finding that talent, interviewing that talent, and getting them through kind of the first stages of that process. And then, of course, consulting with the company about creating the job description and, the onboarding plan, 30, 60, 90, et cetera. And so the communities, and I think this is where a community manager or leader really comes into play. They need to have some expertise, or at least the empathy for the community that they're running. We've hired, new GMs, new community leaders for communities that we've acquired. And, that's probably the most important thing, is that they have to care. They might not even come from the space, but they have to really care about who they're serving. And everything else ladders down kind of from there.
I like this. Okay. Now, what I want to do next is have this sort of a mini masterclass. We're already doing it into it, but I want to get even more, try to condense some of the common learnings that I had from running all of these businesses. So this will give people more of an understanding of how to grow a community business to 7, maybe even 8 figures of revenue. Now, like to start the conversation, do you have any like favorites when it comes to all the communities in your portfolio? You don't have to name names again, but
You're asking me to like pick my favorite child or choose my favorite
yeah,
dessert.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I
But
mean,
maybe
it's
if not naming, yeah, what are some characteristics of a good versus a bad one that you have?
the communities that have it the hardest tend to focus on the widest market. And we talked a little bit before about total addressable market, right? Larger TAM tends to be better business. That's not always the case, especially in the early days. For smaller communities, it's much better to have a really tight point of view on what user persona you're focusing on and what value proposition you're trying to drive to them. As the community grows, as you add more resources, as as each of those like additional kind of headcount on your team can maybe focus on new user personas and the types of services that might cater to them, that whole community still might operate out of one system, right? But you have a clear kind of focus on how to separate and segment those users based on what you're offering. Um, this is true for every business, but I think for community businesses especially, it becomes very evident pretty quickly whether or not they're actually listening to their members.
Hmm. So what you mean to say is that in like in a community business, since the market, since the it's better if you really focus on the small group of people that you're trying to serve and just have a very deep connection with them in some way
Yeah, that's right. So
without trying to go too
I'll use
wide.
Chief of Staff Network again as an example, right? That's really
Yeah.
catered, initially was really catered to early and growth stage startup chiefs of staff, at kind of accelerating mostly venture-backed companies. As the community has grown, we recognize that there's, of course, other types of chiefs of staff out there, right? From large enterprises, from, universities, from nonprofits that in some ways need similar programs, but have a very different way of working, right? Their jobs are different, their roles are different. And so, the community has had to adapt to that kind of wider market. Then there's lots of other roles out there that look and feel like a chief of staff, but may not actually have the same title. And BizOps is a good example of that. And that's where kind of that second community was born from. And they share a lot of the same resources, a lot of the same content, but they speak to and cater their offerings to different user personas. And those two can work very well together.
Got it. Okay, let me try to give people an example. So you mentioned that you ran Chief of Staff as a free community and then turned it into a paid one. So can you take me back to the initial days of running it as a paid community and talk about what was it that you were offering? So today Chief of Staff offers a lot of things, but back in the early days, what was like the core of your offering that people gave you money for?
I think that the first thing was I had enough brand trust and kind of credibility in that space where the members that I knew and that I knew well were willing to pay to kind of stay involved in just the ecosystem that was there, right? The community. They believed in the other members, and I, of course, did a lot of grandfathering in of like, some very like free or scaled down membership kind of prices to get kind of the first group involved. I think that's critical. Many of those members have moved beyond their chief of staff role and are still very active participants in the community. The early offering was not so dissimilar to the offering that existed as a free community. It was just scaled up. And so, I really committed to hosting, weekly events. I really committed to doing more in-person events. I committed to a weekly member, newsletter. I committed to publishing a job board. I committed to publishing, an entire resource kind of database of all the shared assets and things that had come from the community over the previous years. So a lot of it was just organizing that the community itself had produced. I wasn't the voice of chiefs of staff. I won't sit here and say that I'm the leader of all chiefs of staff. That the community is the leader, right? It's the community is the platform that has built that role, that has helped other people find their way into that role. And the addition of a membership offering was only to improve those benefits.
Right. That's interesting. Have you found that, communities where the founder or the owner is not necessarily the leader of the community, do they have a hard time, easy time, or like an equal time as compared to a community where the founder is the leader and like everybody is trying to follow the founder's path basically?
It's I think that a community founder, as I mentioned earlier, like needs to be very empathetic to the members that they are quote unquote leading. But that doesn't mean that the community founder is the only person that can do that. And very often they are maybe the kind of epitome of what a community member is looking at as like, oh, I want like, especially in a professional context, I want this person as a role model for my career. I think that's best case scenario, but it's not 100% necessary. I think if the community leader again is empathetic, understands the position, understands the types of challenges that their members may be going through, the types of professional questions or engagements that help them accelerate, their own careers, that's enough to provide the value that a member deserves as part of that community. If the community leader can't do it, then it's on them to help the rest of the community empower those individual members, right, to get that value. I would say kind of beyond the leader, it's really about, can we foster their types of relationships, the types of conversations? Can we build enough trust in this environment where people will be open to sharing those questions and those answers in a forum is unlike what someone might see on LinkedIn or Twitter or some other, more public kind of social media platform. And that's, I think, what gets us to the real value of these communities and that they, in a lot of ways, need to exist because those conversations are not happening on LinkedIn and Twitter. The real like part of professional growth, I think, is happening in these private communities, whether they're paid or free, it doesn't really matter, but they're happening behind closed doors.
That is a fascinating insight. Yeah, I found that to be true in my own career as well. Like first as a community manager and now as a very bootstrap founder. Like I'm getting most of my learnings not from LinkedIn, Twitter, or any of these public places, but from the smaller Slack
Mm.
communities that I'm a part of.
Yeah, and I think we're only going to continue to see that trend in this generation and next generations in the workforce are going to be turning to their peers to learn what it takes to grow in a particular role. It's not that an individual company can't necessarily do that for them, but people move businesses faster than they ever have before. And I think it's very difficult for a business to focus A on building their business, but B to provide the learning and development opportunities that this next generation is demanding, from them. And and these roles are getting more complex, right? That is, I think, one of the reasons that the chief of staff role for me was always so interesting.
Let's talk about pricing. Do you have a preferred pricing like strategy for these community businesses, or how do you think about it?
So pricing is it's a delicate balance, right? Between like perceived value and accessibility. So if you look at large communities like Chief or, Hampton's new release, accessibility is kind of like the thing that drives the price point, right? This is a very closed community. It's very invite only. You've got to reach, you've got to very much fit in this user persona, certain amount of revenue, certain amount of, venture money raised, what have you, certain level in your career to even be considered to join. That accessibility and, the kind of founding team's ability to like create the marketing around that accessibility, a testament to them, is what drive the main driver of the price. The ultimate like thing that those communities, like and most communities are providing, connections to people, access to courses, access to roundtables or cohorts or pods or whatever you want to call them. They're all the same. Like they boil down to a lot of the same types of interactions. Some may be managed better than others. Some may have a professional coach, there as the kind of mediator between people. These things certainly help, but the products and services tend to look and feel pretty similar. Price comes down to accessibility and perceived value. And so a lot of price is really garnered by what is the market willing to pay for it. So a higher price point tends to mean that you're going to have potentially a smaller audience that may be better, may end up being a better experience for everybody. But you're definitely not looking at mass market. A lower price point, of course, means you're going to be more attractive to more people, but that means you run the risk of diluting the community, catering to users that don't necessarily meet, that kind of targeted user persona, which gets us back into, an earlier part of our conversation. And so it's that balancing act. I think, can you build the perceived value and deliver those services adequately to that user persona that you're targeting? And can you create kind of the accessibility from a marketing standpoint that can drive a higher price point, beyond what it might actually be worth?
Hmm. And talking about creating the demand to grow the community, do you have certain go-to levers that you pull when you think of growing a new community that you've basically acquired?
So I'm going to repeat myself for the third time, but user persona first.
Okay.
Know who you're solving for and what you're going to solve. How does that group of similar people come together to solve a problem better than the individual could on his or her own? That is the reason for the community's existence. I think great communities understand that intimately, and they they poll their audience, they do the surveys, they run the analytics to re-understand that question. That's like factor one. Number two is probably content, or at least from our perspective, we're leaning more and more into content. That's newsletters, it's podcasts, it's blog posts, it's job boards, resource guides and playbooks and courses. Like communities need to be content machines, and building that content needs to again speak to that audience, as intimately as possible. That builds brand trust and it builds a willingness for that audience to potentially come and pay for something more than the free things that you're giving them. That then leads into, third part of the strategy, organic growth. I think paid marketing for most communities is maybe worth trialing, but very rarely the thing that's going to drive, certainly not in the early days. Maybe later on, as you have more scale, it helps to drive access to new audiences that you're maybe not speaking to as well. Member referrals is a big factor. I think it's better as an indicator for understanding community health. So if we're getting a consistent number of referrals per month, sure, we want to drive that number, but what we don't want to see is that number falling kind of off a cliff. And so member referrals is good for understanding health. I would say kind of beyond most things though, going back to the content side, like don't underestimate top of funnel traffic. We spend a lot of time monitoring the channels that are driving traffic to our sites, considering ways to optimize that traffic, thinking about if they're coming to the website from X channel, where do we want to convert them? Is it, off downloading a resource report? Is it getting them over to a job board because they might be job seeking? Is it getting them to subscribe to one of the newsletters because that content will build more meaningful engagement from this particular person? It's better to nurture that traffic then and get them to engage across those touch points first before converting them into like the main course, right? The membership, the paid for elements, the conference, the events. And so this is, I think when we look at a lot of the tools and kind of platforms that we're building behind the scenes for our own businesses, it's things like touch point monitoring, enrichment, right? How do we get a better understanding of the person coming to our website? And maybe they signed up for a newsletter, but do we really know who they are? Do we know where they're working, what location they're in? What can we target specific events or offerings to this person based on that knowledge? And then all of that is kind of wrapped up in like managing a CRM effectively. I've seen how many community maps have you seen where it's like dozens of platforms, dotted lines between all of them, and just breakage in terms of where data is going and who's managing members where, and who's managing pricing and subscriptions in one platform and getting that to synchronize with another platform. Like that's still a huge challenge for businesses generally. Community businesses don't have it any easier, and they tend to be very small teams that are under-resourced to do that properly.
Hmm. I think this might be a good segue to talk about the tool that you're building. Do you want to talk about it?
So we've built a number of tools, functionality for our own communities, mostly using low-code platforms and sometimes full kind of homegrown solutions. One of the biggest headaches for any business, and especially very people-centric businesses like the ones we run, is managing data across platforms. And the best communities we see are leveraging a range of tools to power their businesses. Even the ones that are using, all-in-one solutions like Circle or Mighty Networks, they still have CRMs, they've got email service providers, they've got curated connection platform, right? Like they're using tools to manage those touch points and build more effective value offering for their members. We're taking a lot of the learnings that we've, encountered building value for our own communities and kind of custom solutions for those businesses, and now productizing them into a suite of tools that other communities outside of Sylva can use as well. We started very definitively with better Slack management tools, especially for communities not paying for Slack today. That includes things like a data repository, deeper analytics, custom segmentation, automated workflows, a built-in AI writer that can leverage the conversations happening between members and turn that into a content generation engine for communities, right? Newsletters, blog posts, et cetera. And create kind of a lot more value that the community has to offer to members, again, on that one touch point on Slack. Where we're taking this now is how do we build kind of the lightweight customer data platform for communities to harness all of those touch points, curated connections, Zoom meetups, in-person events, and get the full well-rounded picture of, is this member actually engaged? What channels are they engaging on? And based on what we know about them or what they're expressing kind of in those conversations, can we personalize the community experience further than we are today? And can we automate, a lot of the tactical jobs that a community manager has to wake up every day and think about, which are critical to the day-to-day experience of a member, but may not be the most strategic or best use of that community manager's time in the long run. And so, there's no way that you replace the human involved in managing communities today, but you can certainly replace or amplify a lot of the work that he or she is doing in keeping these communities kind of actively engaged and healthy.
I love this. I think this is really smart because I've also found this in my own interviews with other community operators and product research interviews that there are so many things that you just mentioned that can be automated, but there is just not enough tooling around them because the market like not a lot of people are focusing on making the community managers' lives easier, so that they can focus on the more bigger picture stuff. So I think what you just mentioned, yeah, it's really helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think that there's a difference also between a SaaS business using a community to drive, community-led growth, right? Of people that might go buy Airtable or Salesforce or whatever. And those are communities, like full stop. But they are very different than the communities that I think you and I are talking about, where again, the community is the product, the community is the business, and there's nothing else kind of being sold along the sides of it. It's you're getting what you're paying for that access for. Um, and those community managers have they're two different worlds, I think, when it comes to running communities, because the goals are different for both of those organizations.
Yeah, that's exactly what I've found. Like When it comes to these communities, they feel like, in my opinion, they're much more member focused than a community that is ultimately trying to sell a SaaS offering to the members. Like you have to intensely care about every member's experience, otherwise they're just gonna churn and you've lost them. So yeah, there's a constant involvement required to serve every member in these types of communities.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, I love this. Okay. Now, talking about tools, what other tools do you prefer using for your community? Let's say for group chats, I feel like you might be in the Slack camp. Do you prefer Slack or
So
other
we're
newer
we're
tools?
we're I'm in the Slack camp, but I will caveat that by saying Slack is very much a double-edged sword, and Salesforce is not building Slack that I think in a way that accommodates communities very well. And so while it is a single click away and the de facto platform that many professionals today are used to using in their own businesses, and it reduces a lot of the friction for the learning curve of any new platform, there are certainly lots of downsides around Slack. And that's why we've started building our own tooling to accommodate for some of those problems from a community manager's perspective and ultimately from a member's perspective as well. Um, but yeah, I unfortunately, like, as much as I love the circles and the mighty networks of the world, I'm I may be in a camp all by myself and saying I don't think that the all-in-one solutions are really where the best communities are going to be built. I think I think that great communities want to be on a chat platform, and everything else ends up needing to be super white labeled and or custom.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm with you here. I feel like the best communities, like they need to meet members where they are instead of asking them to go to all of these different places. So that's like using Slack, using email, or even like using Zoom as much as possible so that members like don't have there's very little like switching cost, because I found that can just drop engagement and the motivation of members to talk to others in the community.
Yeah, that's right. I can't tell you the number of times we've considered building our own version of Circle, only to come back to that realization that any new platform is not going to meet members where they are any more effectively than the solutions that exist today are. And I think I would much rather build a system that lives as a layer on top of all those platforms and, can orchestrate an amazing member experience regardless of what the community has chosen to use for any one of those touch points. If you're using courses and you want to go to Udemy or I don't know, Teachable or some other platform, like great, you should be able to do that. But you should also be able to ladder that data back into your CRM so that who's actually participated in the course and who you should be emailing at the right time, et cetera. And there's way too much breakage between kind of those systems today that I think is not well taken care of.
Yeah, I like that. And are there any needs that you feel like, apart from the tool that you've obviously built to scratch your own need, but are there any other tools that you feel are needed by communities like these that currently don't exist?
I think enrichment is actually a big, like data enrichment is a big need that can be satisfied with some off-the-shelf solutions, but they tend to be very expensive. And the reason that enrichment, at least from a professional kind of community context, is important. People change jobs, they move locations, they get promotions, their title changes, and the data that you might have collected a year ago ends up being static and irrelevant 6 or 12 months later. And all of a sudden you're targeting who you thought was a junior engineer and is now the head of data at some other company. And and you're wondering, why is the message not catering? Like, why is the course offering not catering to this person? And so data enrichment is a critical component. You have to have the most relevant data to your audience to be serving them properly. I won't sit here and say we haven't built it, because we have built it, and it is being productized in the tool kind of as we speak. But I think that is something that a lot more communities should pay attention to.
Mm, yeah, I like that. And when it comes to member engagement, are there any tools, like any features, like any important things that you feel is frustrating about the current way these tools work? Maybe like you use Luma or maybe you use Zoom. Like, is there anything that you wish they had that would make your life easier?
Luma got rid of the multi-day events online,
Yeah.
and so that's been a real headache. I don't want to turn this into a complaining fest. No, I mean, I think those tools are kind of purpose built and frankly work pretty well for these businesses. Luma really has grown a lot over the last couple years, and we've been using them, I think, basically from day one. Zoom always leaves something to be desired. There's always something broken with Zoom, but it is still again like the easiest touch point for a member to just log in and know the experience they're going to get as part of that video conferencing platform. I think CRM is probably an underrepresented. It's a thing that a lot of people talk about all the time, but I think in terms of actually implementing a CRM properly and using all the bells and whistles that a HubSpot or a Salesforce or a Pipedream or whatever has to offer is something that we've come a long way in implementing. I mean, it's taken us a lot longer than I thought it would to really figure out how to use HubSpot properly for the type of marketing and messaging that we're doing to our members or the prospects. And yeah, I think there's more to be gained there probably from a lot of community businesses by way of CRMs.
Okay, nice to know that. So thank you for sharing all of this insight. So I want to ask you the final question of this interview now, Scott. When you think about your time, all those times when you've been building a business and really trying to tackle a difficult problem, what's the thing that has kept you up most nights in that process? And like in corollary, like what should the community creators who are listening to this podcast spend most of their nights thinking about that can
I think so much of the community comes down, and you're the face of this as well. It comes down to connections, right? Our members meeting other members. It's not that it's not that you can't meet other people on the internet generally, but there is a point of reference of, hey, we're both in the same place. And this place is not like a large social media network, right? We're not just like interacting on Twitter. I'm sure there are lots of friendships that have emerged from Twitter. I'm sure very few of those people have probably met each other in real life. That's very different than I think exists in these communities, because there is a layer that has been created, not that you're paying to be here, but like maybe you were accepted into the community, it might still be a free community. Maybe, you applied and shared enough details about your profile for someone to build trust and empathy towards the experience that you're going through without ever having an actual conversation, right? And that's, I think, the beauty of these communities is that they can foster a sense of belonging, a sense of identity to their members that opens them up to the experience of meeting other people in similar shoes as their own. That's the thing that you should go to bed thinking about. How do I build more of that? That might be through tools. It might be through more of your time spent with members. Your time is obviously not, it's not infinite. It's a finite resource. And so leveraging the kinds of platforms out there to facilitate more of that feeling of belongingness is what drives the community health. If you have a healthy community, there's plenty of ways to build a healthy community business that shouldn't be underestimated, shouldn't be undervalued. And those two things can come together to create something really meaningful.
love this. All right, I completely agree with you there, obviously, and I think this was really insightful. So thank you so much, Scott, for on and chatting with me about communities on this episode. And any place where you would like the listeners to go to learn more about your work with Sylva or the new tool that you're launching?
Yeah, of course. So you can visit my LinkedIn, just Scott Amenta, easy to find, or joinmitra.com, and I'll share a link with you as well if you're willing to put it in. It's a brand new domain. So, and yeah, we're excited to release this tool to other communities in the coming weeks. And I'm happy to chat with any community founders, builders, people dreaming of starting their community, if I can provide a resource to be helpful.
Love this. Okay, I'll link to all of these resources in the show notes. And thank you so much for coming on the show today, Scott.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate the questions. Really well run, and excited to see where you go with your product.
Thank you.
We're excited to be users of your product, I should